Ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between, it is Debate Sensei IPDA Edition, where we discuss things that are relevant to competitive debate for the International Public Debate Association. I have with me my Chief Banter Officer, Tim Seavey from Proto Communications. Hello, Tim. Yes, we are here. I'm Jared Kabika Miller. I'm a professor of communications at Santiago Canyon College, just like discussing things about debate, hopefully putting stuff out there that is helpful to you as a coach, as a competitor, or just as an enthusiast. All right.
And in the IPDA space, you never know what kind of topic you're going to get. So it's kind of helpful to be a little bit of an expert about a lot of bit of things.
Yeah. And so a lot of bit of things. I like that. What we like to do is have our own little series inside of a series here, which is you got to get familiar with international affairs on some level. And last season and through this season, we decided to break up the world based on the different tectonic plates. And so the countries that reside on those plates, we deal with one at a time. And we are now at the South American tectonic plate. So all the countries on the South American continent, which is roughly 12. There's roughly a dozen different countries on there that we looked up, and we're going to discuss as much as we can the different issues that might come up in a debate round that deal with these countries.
Yeah, so I don't think it's the case that you have to, it's even reasonable to know everything going on everywhere or have even strong ideas, but to, check out the Latin America tab on various news sites, right? Like get a good understanding of what's going on. Because it gets very easy to be very sucked into American news cycles, like domestic US news channel. I mean, even like local stuff, there's just such an ungodly volume of content. It's easy to get very myopic and like focused on just things that are right in front of you. But broadening that out, I really like when tournaments throw out topics that are not on the contents or the continents that we typically debate. So these would be kind of fun ones.
I would recommend that some tournaments actually have rounds where the theme is based on like international politics or even a specific, like you could have an entire set of resolutions that is just on South America. You know what I mean? And so like you could have 5 different topics that they choose from, but all of them are South American topics. I think that's a perfectly valid way to go about writing topics and presenting them in the rounds.
Yeah, I think so too. So first place to start, I think fun ones that come about tend to be, so some of the like big salient issues that I see when looking at South American news or issues facing are various like issues of political unrest, issues of environmental versus economic development. Those ones I think are pretty good for debate rounds. It doesn't become just like, oh, sanction this. It's like, all right, well, what would this do locally? What is the short-term? What are long-term impacts? So one fun one that I wanted to just get into right away is the Darien Gap. So there does not exist a Pan-American highway that's unbroken. So you cannot drive from Alaska all the way down to the tip of Patagonia in Argentina. There's a little tiny gap between Panama and Colombia, and that's called the Darien Gap. And it's like this stretch of jungle that is just so thick and so dense that it is impossible to build a road through. And there's like all kinds of good environmental reasons not to build anything through that space because it's like dense, thick rainforest. But doesn't stop that from becoming a debate topic of like, hey, a Pan-American highway would save a whole lot of jet fuel and like potential like tankers in the ocean and other stuff like that. So like, what would that really mean if a highway were developed through it? What are the pros and cons? So I think like that as a topic is like a pretty good one. It's at least common to come up in rounds like, hey, we've got some potential immediate economic booms from doing this thing, and there's probably some significant environmental costs. Let's weigh those things out, right? Or maybe, turns out it's actually not that big of a boom. So anyways, where there's a lot of advantage, I think, would be in safety for migration. So right now, any, folks that are migrating, there's like a huge exodus of folks from Venezuela, for example. And unless you can afford a plane ticket or a boat ticket, I don't even know if there's a ton of boats that travel all the way up, to get anywhere off the South American continent, you would have to walk literally through the Darien Gap. and it's also a super dangerous place. There's a huge amount of, besides just the actual physical danger, there's also a bunch of like gangs and like human traffickers that set up camp there because they know that's a place of like very vulnerable migration. So
yeah, I mean, now that you say it though, like having that highway there might actually expose it, and like they may get cover from the fact that there is no highway, and with a highway there, you have things like, law enforcement can access them a lot quicker, and so like it might,
right,
yeah,
right, yeah. So it kind of shines light in a dark place is maybe like an argument that I would try and make there. I think that there's much better environmental arguments. I don't think that there's really any round that you could win to be like, yeah, well, we're going to build a highway through this like, untouched forest, or for the most part, untouched forest. And that's going to be good. Like, let's just cut down some rainforest to build a gas station halfway in between. Like that's never going to go particularly well environmentally. But I don't know, maybe there are more inventive ways that can come about. Like, I think there are probably arguments to be made for like the environmental impact of the Panama Canal that seemed like that was a nearly impossible task. And yet the economic advantages of it, like global trade would not look the way that it does today were it not for the Panama Canal that allows ships to pass through. So you could say that like this as a road would be something equivalent to the Panama Canal. How best can we minimize the environmental impact or something like that?
Yeah, indigenous communities, I think, also are something you want to look into as far as who'd be there. Honduras, Nicaragua. I'm looking up indigenous group. I can't pronounce all these, but Nagabe Bulgi, residing in the western part of the country. I wonder, because Panama is pretty, like east and west is not that far apart from each other. So I wonder if that would be okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
there are definitely a lot of indigenous. I didn't mean to say that like that stretch is only inhabited by nefarious folks. Like there's also a lot of indigenous tribes. It's a really good point there.
Yeah,
it would be disruptive to a lot of the flora and fauna and indigenous folks that live there. So like those types of resolutions are tough.
Yeah, it looks like Imbara and Wunan are a couple of indigenous tribes that live specifically in the Darien Gap. At least that's according to ChatGPT. And ChatGPT is kind of like hit or miss sometimes. It's kind of like that drunk uncle that is kind of intelligent, but if it's been hallucinating enough, it could just be giving you some BS. So yeah.
So, all right. So besides that guy, I think that as a topic comes up a decent amount. So good arguments to be, thinking of in advance on the pro and the con. Other countries.
Colombia. So like, since we're still there, right? Now when I was debating, Plan Colombia was just this major topic. And I know that it's not really like in effect anymore. But it has transitioned from Plan Colombia to Peace Colombia. I do not know enough about what is the same or what is different, but the main sticking point on Plan Colombia was the fumigation in order to eradicate coca crops. And so that was, a big deal back in the day. The environmental and humanitarian sort of blowback from that, the amount of money that the FARC got, the military, the paramilitary group in Colombia, was also a major sticking point. The human rights abuses that they committed. I'd recommend people updating themselves on that, just looking and seeing what sort of remnants of that policy are still in place, because sometimes throwback arguments like that are good to go for. And I'm just interested in knowing about that. We even have a Plan Colombia video on our channel you can go and check out. And so, and there's been some very vocal people leaving comments there as well.
There's an interesting note on Colombia is the textile trade. So textiles have kind of moved all over the world in recent years of just like, where is it cheapest and most efficient to manufacture things? So China was pretty much the best player for a long time, like where you could get the fastest made, cheapest goods, specifically textiles. So like t-shirts. And then it moved to, I want to say Malaysia, And then Colombia was the next biggest thing. So for a good while, like up until very, very recently, and still to a large extent, Colombia has like a pretty good advantage on having extremely fast, skilled seamstresses. It's like the folks are crafts folks that are able to like make clothing. The problem is that everywhere that the textile industry has been, as soon as that population kind of reaches a certain income threshold, the costs, like, everything kind of goes up, and that cost now becomes untenable, and the industry moves elsewhere. So it like is always kind of boosted countries up to a certain level, and then not beyond that. It's kind of reaching that ceiling in Colombia to where Bangladesh is now being like one of the big hubs for clothing manufacturing, and those jobs are moving away from Colombia. That's not all necessarily a bad thing. Like, there's arguments to be made like Colombia is better off than before it. But I think that's like, what's next type topics are probably likely to come up of like, okay, after textiles, here's what China pivoted to. After textiles, here's what Malaysia did. Now that, it looks like textiles are kind of on their way out of Colombia, what's next is an important question, because Colombia is definitely better off now than it was maybe 5 years ago, economically at least.
Okay. Man, we've already got 12 minutes into it, and I think we got to move. Okay, so
Sure.
I do have another idea. I'm thinking elections in these countries in general, right?
Yeah.
And so one thing is like I'm noticing a Trump effect. Basically everyone is now, so any sort of like opposition, or if they lose, it's always a coup. Like nobody is conceding elections, or people are conceding them less and less. And Colombia is one of them. So like President Petro right now is getting investigated for, election sort of, signs that there was impropriety, but also Maduro in Venezuela. And I think also in
Lula in Brazil.
Yeah. It was Lula in Brazil. And I also think, there was another one. Was it in, not in,
why you find that? Yeah. Maduro in Venezuela is probably like the most extreme example. Venezuela is in just a really awful position. So like a quarter of the country has fled. It's like 8 million people have left Venezuela. So Maduro, there were supposedly elections, like free and fair elections in July, and Maduro lost like after the election, after the opposing party was able to produce ballot boxes that showed that he lost by like a 2-1 margin. And then those people were politically blacklisted, and where, many were arrested, and a lot of people were killed in protests and things. His only other opponents were told that like they would be arrested if they ever said anything. So the person that won was just exiled, and then eventually like showed up in Spain. So the U.S. even formally recognized his opponent as having beat Maduro in the election, because like independent election investigators from like the UN looked through all the data that was available and were like, yeah, Maduro definitely lost, and he still has not even close to conceded that. So it is kind of a gnarly, like there is no transition of power situation.
Yeah, so it's Bolivia. Evo Morales, I don't think that it's necessarily an election issue, but he's on a hunger strike right now. To talk about, he's like trying to get his rival to the negotiating table. I also think that Peru has is similar issues. Alejandro Toledo is an ex-president, and he's been sentenced to 20 years for corruption. So it seems like there's a lot of sort of like political movements happening on like their justice departments. They're using this as like weaponizing it, and or for one way or the other, right? What I mean? It's like they're using it to either dispute free and fair elections, or to claim victory when they didn't, or to imprison their opponents even if they did win legitimately. It's like, yeah.
So maybe there's a topic in there around how should elections be shored up? Right?
Yeah.
Like, does there exist some mechanism that more or less like prevents this kind of really power, or failure of transition of power?
Like independent evaluators of of elections, or things like that, like third party investigators coming in. It's like, is there any international body that can do that, and if they should they come in? Yeah.
And so you've got, for example, like even in Venezuela, it was like a UN council that reviews elections, and
Right.
you're some of the body that is, theoretically impartial to be able to say, if this is what the country wants, like the country wants to have an election, we can help with that. There's probably good arguments around like, self-determination, though, that a third party coming in to facilitate elections may be swayed or may not actually like be giving the people what they're asking for. It's just another form of like paternalism of like, let's impose democracy. Yet when it's like a group of people that want a particular thing and none of the folks in power are willing to implement that thing, how does that change go about happening? Because just, all right, well, the people should form a militia and rise up with a coup. Like that also happens, and that doesn't seem to solve the problem, right?
Yeah. So so that'd be like elections. I think that's really interesting. We could talk about, like a lot of topics usually are about how do these countries affect the United States? What's the interaction that you have with them? And so Venezuela, I think, is one of the major players, but Brazil is also another major player, like the largest country on the continent. And I think one of the things that just recently happened with that is the BRICS meeting. BRICS being the Brazil, Russia, India, China, which
South America. BRICS. There's an S at the end, yeah.
But South America.
I'm sorry, South Africa. Excuse me, South Africa.
Yeah. So so that meeting just recently happened, and so the major sort of component of that was that Russia is supposed to be this pariah, you know what I mean? That we're trying to sanction them and because of the invasion of the Ukraine and annexing Crimea, and they just got a bunch of soldiers from North Korea that apparently are going to be going to the Ukraine war. And so Brazil going there is like this endorsement of Russia. And not only that, but that actually pissed off Venezuela because they wanted to be a part of it. And so now these two South American countries sort of like, what role do they play in this even larger stage of international politics is definitely an issue that could come up in a debate.
Yeah, like the emerging market of each of those countries, like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, like there are very significant players individually, and now then coming together, not just economically, but politically, and you could argue even like militarily, like there is now a pretty solid consolidation of power there. And so there are good arguments, or there are good topics, I suppose, in there of, when there's conflicts, right? Like who is a mediator? So there was a whole bunch of, press over like Putin mediating some relationships between Xi Jinping and Modi, right? The Indian and Chinese leaders respectively. And it's like, wow, what a new position that puts him in. Like, where does Brazil play in all this? Like, what is Brazil now on the outside? Like, is Brazil have a responsibility to check back? Is Brazil is something of like a mediator between, or are they like an envoy from the U.S.? Like, who do they speak for, or what's their role in it? So I think those are more extemp topics, but they're good debate topics as well of like what best can be done.
Yeah, I mean, like, because Brazil like literally vetoed Venezuela from entering the BRICS. I guess there's some sort of formal joining process. So one of the topics could be about additional countries joining BRICS, and like what would be the fallout of Venezuela joining it, or any of the other South American countries, let alone any other country in the world, because BRICS already represents, I think, more than half of the world population, doesn't it?
Oh, easily, yeah. India and China alone is already pretty dang close.
Yeah, it's like damn near half, right? So I mean, they have over 1 billion each. We have 8 billion people in the world, and I mean, like you start getting about
close. So
that's interesting.
Like just the economic, but also like political capacity that is consolidated there. So I think also like what Brazil's roles and responsibilities become with that. So I think there's a lot of press coverage and things around some of the like much more modern fanfare, right? So like when the World Cup went to Brazil, right? Mm-hmm. Or like F1 just had a big stop at Sao Paulo. and like that, brings a lot of spotlight, like tourism and trade and things. Yet there is still, very significant danger in Brazil. Like murder is still like one of the highest murder rates in the industrialized world, right? So there's arguments, I think, to be made about like what can Brazil do to speed up. I guess again, these are sounding a little bit more like extemp topics, but still, like, there's good policy to be made in there of like, what steps a country can take to make itself more appealing to trade or to tourism or to additional international partnerships or something like that, when some of its own internal policies still seem to be really crumbling down.
Okay.
Which I suppose any country is also guilty of that, right?
Yeah. All right. Let's see here. The next largest player, it'd probably be Argentina.
Yeah.
Probably, right? And I guess there's it seems, I don't know about you, but it seems like economics would probably be the most likely issue that would come up for Argentina, because everyone's talking about, they keep saying this phrase about a chainsaw that the what's his name, Milei, I don't know, he's like I guess he's let me see what he's some politician there, and everyone, I guess he said he's taking a chainsaw to their budget or something like that. President Milei planned to trim the bureaucratic access by using a chainsaw. And so like one of the debate might be about whether or not that's going to cause like just major economic upheaval, positive, negative, one way or the other, not sure.
Sure.
Yeah. And Argentina is a giant freaking economy, not just for South America, but for the world.
Right. And I think there's also like a pretty booming amount of, I don't know, travel, trade. Like it seems like Argentina's, I mean, maybe a good argument to be made for joining BRICS. I'm not sure from like a GDP perspective or something, if there's like a threshold that BRICS countries try to maintain, but it does, seem like Argentina might be, approaching something like that. So I don't know, probably good questions to say, like, what are the benefits and drawbacks to increased tourism, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you've got extremely like fragile. I think that's probably a good argument overall of South American tectonic plate topics, is like you've got some of the most important and at risk ecosystems in the world. Like you have so much rainforest, but then all the way down in Patagonia, also you've got like the closest thing we've got to ice caps, right? Like the closest point to get to Antarctica, where like Patagonia at many points is also completely untouched, but you can see the effects of climate change. And so like, all right, what can be done to protect some of these really vulnerable ecosystems? Like that same topic, I suppose, can probably go for many South American nations, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another issue for Argentina, I guess, is their role in cryptocurrency. Like they've really embraced cryptocurrency. It's kind of like, I think the only other country that might like be more radical is El Salvador. But
okay,
like,
yeah, that accepts its official currency.
Yeah. And so, so like those financial risks, just cryptocurrency in general. If you just have a cryptocurrency topic in debate, you might want to be thinking about Argentina, because any country that has invested $91 billion or has $91 billion wrapped up in cryptocurrency, and if their economy tanks, that will affect the currency, right? Like
Sure.
it's and so how will it affect the currency? And like that could be a nice little sort of link story in a disadvantage over any crypto topic that you might have.
Yeah, I think that's a good one, because sometimes when talking about crypto in just domestic terms, it's like, oh, the economic fallout that comes from this is all very padded, because it's like the value of the dollar doesn't tank when Bitcoin goes down. Right. But you have a much more significant impact story when like a nation's currency, like what they're really relying on, is tied to something with that much volatility. Or, even if it's like saying like, oh, they want to create their own stable coin, like what risk does that have if the peg breaks? Like how stable is that compared to what they previously had? I think there's some really like fascinating and fairly like recent economic development stories in some South American countries. So it's like hyperinflation is something that affected Brazil like in our lifetime, like pretty recently. Hyperinflation being inflation rates of 1,000% over the course of a year. So we talk about inflation being bad in the US, but like there are places that have that degree of just unbelievable inflation. Like things are going to cost 100% more next month. And what that really does, like in creating this like death spiral, and how to go about changing that, because Brazil came out of that. Like inflation isn't perfect, but it still is, not at the crippling level that it was. And some like amazing things went into that. I think inflation still affects a lot of the countries that are, maybe very resource rich, but coming into these macroeconomic, world trade stages really, really quickly. So I think those are interesting, anecdotes to go for, but also you can talk about like, these are real testing grounds. So I like the crypto topic as well. It's a cool link story.
Yeah, it is cool. I'm trying to find stuff in other countries. I'm not finding too much that really screams like, oh, you want to know this for debate. Like in Chile, yeah, there's, they got election coming up, and there's somebody who is, on, the opponents and bringing it up. But I don't know. I'm not seeing anything. Suriname, Guyana.
I think so. Peru, ecotourism.
Okay.
I think the topic of ecotourism comes up a lot, and I think you've got good link stories in Peru, and then I think also in Costa Rica is a really good link story. I would technically be the Caribbean plate being in Central America, but pretty close, I suppose. Like by a globe, that might still be South America or close to it. But so Peru, like Machu Picchu, ecotourism, when people want to visit a place to appreciate the landscape, with that tourism also inevitably comes all kinds of ecological backlash, right? So there has to be bathrooms, there has to be, places for food and water, and just all the stuff that lots and lots of people require. So when the purpose is to appreciate this natural, untouched environment, environmental, UNESCO protected site, and yet it receives millions and millions of people going to it, that tends to wear stuff down. So the trade-off between those two ends up becoming, I think this came up a lot when we were talking about Nepal, right? Or like Sherpas, right? So,
Everest,
yeah. So the same folks that are helping, that are like, essentially, the Sherpas for the Andes that are helping tourists make their way through these enormous hikes, I imagine probably face many of the same challenges as Sherpas, maybe not quite as extreme as those in Nepal, but still like extremely low wages, very contingent upon, travel. And like, is that helping or hurting what is supposed to be globally appreciated in these circumstances?
Another aspect of Peru's role, this becomes more like larger international politics, is the relationship they have with China, because a U.S. general actually, is warning that they have this new port with really deep water, and like Chinese warships could like dock there and things. And so, the U.S. Army is actually kind of looking at Peru as a potential, relationship with China. That makes them a player, you know what I mean? Like, and so those can be link stories and narratives that could become in a debate round as well. Yeah. What else? We have, I didn't see anything with, I don't know. I mean, there was recently a vote in the UN for like recognizing Cuba, and I know Cuba's not on the South American plate, but there was a lot of countries in South America that voted in favor of it, and that is kind of rattled people, and so that could be something.
Yeah, I forgot that there was one more, and that was for Ecuador. I want to say it was, but and the same argument goes in Brazil, and that was so American billionaires, or kind of billionaires from anywhere that's not there, buying up huge swaths of rainforest so as to prevent them from being cut down. So in Ecuador, for example, like they cut down it wasn't Ecuador, it was Nicaragua. Nicaragua cut down a huge percentage of its rainforest because beef production, or like the demand for beef, was just going up significantly. So if you look at like time-lapse photos of the same, like satellite photos of the same area of forest, just nasty, like really awful. And that stuff like you can't just grow back rainforest. So arguments being like, all right, well, what can the government do? Like, well, when you're faced with like, here's a booming industry and something that can, provide a lot of economic growth versus here's this natural resource. One of the positions was like, okay, we'll just buy up all of that space. But still, when it's just like people that are living on or near that land that now can't do anything with that, what is used to offset it? So, just owning the land isn't enough. Like, how do you go about, still providing actual income and an opportunity for the folks that live there that is not tied to cutting down that portion of the rainforest?
And there's a little bit of trivia about Ecuador, that the some leaders in Ecuador have had their visas banned from entering the U.S. because being accused of corruption. And so that so U.S. and Ecuador have a bit of friction right now. I don't know, like knowing that sometimes might come in helpful, but depending on what the topic is. But just understanding what the relationship is between the country that you're living in and the countries that you're talking about, I think is important and helpful.
Sure.
Yeah.
So tournament directors, write more topics about South America.
Yeah. I mean, I think,
there's a wealth of options there.
And I think having a much broader understanding of the history between the United States and all of the Americas, North, Central, South, is also important. Like just understanding the Marshall Plan and how that affected the relationship between all these countries, how Southcom, Southern Command, the U.S. Army, like and the like drug interdiction in the Pacific, things like that are also important in understanding the relationship between the entire continent and the United States is also really helpful. Because let's be honest, most of the time when you're debating, it's usually a very sort of U.S. centered perspective, just because that's where we live and that's what we know, and that's usually how the resolutions are framed.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, man, that's just a blitz of a number, and we didn't even get to all of them. I don't think we talked about Paraguay at all.
Nope.
But regardless, South America has a rich amount of information that could be useful in a debate. I recommend definitely looking deeper into it.
Cool.
All right, everybody. Hey, that's our episode. We'll have episodes in the future. We are Jared and Tim for Debate Sensei. We'll see you later.
Enjoy.